I'll do it. I actually totally forgot about that. I neglected your request.
I kind of did too, and then I like looked at my emails this morning.
Did everybody see a record notification come up? I think we're
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
good. Sorry, I'm just a little nervous about technology, so.
COVID is starting to feel like a long time ago. Zoom has changed since then.
Yep. So Eric, when should we start the?
I think we're ready to go, Robert.
Okay.
Why don't I kick us off here?
Perfect.
Welcome, everyone. I see we have a good attendance today of 45 or so folks on the Zoom call. This call is an orientation to strategic action planning, which we're really excited to have BEF, Bonneville Environment Foundation, present to all of you. We were just talking about this in the lead up to this meeting, that this is the 10th year that we've been in partnership with Bonneville Environmental Foundation on the FIP program. And, you know, in reflecting on those 10 years, I think we've come a long way in terms of the structure of the Focused Investment Partnership Program. And I think a really important thing to keep in mind in that history is that while we often talk about the FIP program, or Focused Investment Partnership Initiative, the strategic action plan planning work that's been done by many partnerships now throughout the state really has helped position those partnerships for success, regardless of funder or what the local situation is. And FIP certainly isn't the only game in town. And so we have seen many groups work towards strategic action plans that when technical reviewers are looking at proposals, looking at applications in our open solicitation program or other offerings, the question that often gets asked by those reviewers is, is this proposal, is this project taking a strategic approach, addressing priorities for whatever the watershed restoration or habitat needs are? And having gone through a strategic action planning process, that's often really meaningful to our technical reviewers when they see that much effort has gone into trying to decide where and when to do what kind of work. We're really happy with the progress that's been made all around the state in developing strategic action plans. And it, of course, continues to be one of the foundational elements needed to participate in our Focused Investment Partnership Program. And so with that as introduction to the orientation, I'll introduce our BEF team here to take over and present the Strategic Action Plan orientation. We have today Robert Warren and Lauren Mork, who again have been, I'm proud to have partnered with for the last 10 years in this work. So take it away, Robert and Lauren.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And thanks everybody for taking time to join us in this orientation. I know this is often a busy time of year, but maybe it's nice to be inside with some air conditioning if you're still sort of suffering from some of the heat. I think first I'd like to know everybody who's participating. I can see in the screen there's lots of folks online. If you wouldn't mind basically telling us who you are by putting your name, your affiliation, the watershed or the landscape, that's the focus of your work in the chat. And we'll try and save that just to make sure we have captured participation. And we're just interested to see sort of the diversity of folks involved or participating and some of the ecological priorities that you're focused on. And in the meantime, thanks, Eric, for introducing us. As Eric stated, I'm joined here by Lauren Mork with the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council. It's also been my privilege to work with Lauren and the OWEB team on this effort in supporting the Focused Investment Partnership Program. There are two other members of the team, Jennifer Arnold from Reciprocity Consulting and Ann Moot with Mammoth Consulting. And I think many of you maybe interacted with any one of us or all of us at different points in time. If not, we'll be looking forward to maybe getting to know you as well. So again, our work has really been in support of the Focused Investment Partnership Grant Program, even though what we're presenting here today is applicable to any partnership or any organization that wants to develop a strategic action plan for work, especially that they're doing in Oregon, and who intends to, or initiatives that intend to apply for funding through OWEB. So as the title suggests, this orientation is designed to provide an introduction to OWEB strategic action planning guidance. That was one of our early tasks as a team to develop and create. This is actually the third iteration, I think, in terms of guidance that we've had with the FIT program. And so just to answer a couple of questions to start with, what is the SAP planning guidance? What is this guidance? There's a lot of different guidance and frameworks out there, and who is it intended for? So this guidance is meant to provide a consistent and flexible foundation for partnerships to plan and conserve, or to plan a conservation or restoration initiative and track its progress over time. And why is strategic action planning important? Often the term strategic plan will elicit groans and eye rolls, because sometimes those processes can be long and tedious, but they're really important, as Eric mentioned at the beginning. And so some of the benefits that we highlight are that a plan really succinctly articulates key aspects of a conservation initiative's vision, goals, the scope, social and ecological context, strategies or interventions, the theory of change for how those strategies are expected to create desired change, and a framework for tracking that progress. It's also a nice way to document and communicate a partnership's intentions to its members and all potential stakeholders, including funders as well. And it's a basis for making decisions and justifying decisions about how and where to allocate resources. Lauren, I don't know if you're able to see chat and see sort of what you're seeing. Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, so let me start with some logistics here. So in general, we're going to be presenting a lot of material, but we hope, I don't know, as best we can to keep it less formal and allow folks to participate. I think we have, 55 people on the call, so that might be a little bit challenging, but there are ways that you can participate. So those are highlighted here in the orientation notes, and I'll zoom in on that so you can see that a little bit better. So as usual in Zoom meetings, you can chat or raise your hand function during any time during the presentation. If we can't answer a question, or if it needs more time, we'd be happy to follow up afterward. We'll also built in some pauses along the way to see if there are any questions or need for clarification on any of the material that we present. And then we're going to shoot for having a 5-minute break around halftime. So we'll keep an eye on the clock to give you guys a break to get a drink or a bio break. You can see that we're using Mural, a tool called Mural. I don't know how many folks have had any experience with that tool, but it's meant to be a little bit more interactive experience than a typical slide deck. I am putting a link in the chat right now so that you can actually access and enter into the Mural board. So if you're a participant, whether you're on this call or whether you're viewing the recording, you can access the Mural board via the link that I just provided, and we'll make sure that that link is available after this meeting. You can navigate views. So we have this organized as we do the presentation. Up here in the upper right-hand corner, there's an outline button. And if you look at the outline button, you can click on the different views. As we move through the presentation, we'll be clicking on different aspects of the presentation. You can do that on your own as well. You can zoom in and out with your mouse, or you can navigate with your mouse as well. All the elements in the mural are locked, so you can't do anything, you can't break anything. But if you want to drop a note that either we look at or try to look at during the presentation, or we can look at after the presentation. Just double click anywhere and a sticky pad automatically pops up and you can type in whatever it is that you want to type in. And if you decide you don't want it, you can just delete it as well. So that is one other piece of information. Let me go back to where we were. Is that another nice thing about Mural and your interaction with it is that we can embed links into the Mural board. So if there is sort of the standard blue text with line underneath it, there's a link to something that you can, either a material or a website that you can access as well. So for example, I can click on that link and it goes straight to the FIP website. So the links are also are denoted by this sort of link icon next to another icon. Sometimes you'll have to double click on that link, and sometimes you can just click on it once and you'll be able to access that material. All the information that we have here in terms of examples, we were able to take from the internet. So it's all publicly available information. So there may be folks here on the call whose partnership or initiative may be represented as an example, but we were able to get that pretty easily by accessing websites. We are using a number of examples to try and help illustrate some of the key points that we're trying to convey here in the framework. And these weren't selected because they're sort of ideal or perfect. They're all good examples, and they're not intended to sort of be an example that you should sort of copy and use as a template, but they're just there for us to help illustrate certain ideas, concepts, or key points. A word about definition. So the use and definitions of terms can vary across different planning frameworks, as I'm sure you all know. But for this SAP guidance, we really wanted to sort of make a definition and then stick with some consistency to how those terms are used throughout the guidance and throughout this discussion. So we have, and in the guidance, we have defined some of the key terms, but we've also scattered those definitions throughout this presentation in the same color of box. So as we go through different elements of this strategic action plan, you'll see a blue box with a definition of the term that's appropriate or specific to the topic that we're talking about. There are a ton of resources out there that are available, even very specific resources to the state of Oregon and work that's being done in Oregon. As I mentioned, there's a link to the guidance itself if you haven't already seen it. There's a link to the Focused Investment Partnership web page that has information, sort of all the documents and guidance materials that we're going to be talking about today. There are links to the 3 parts of the Partnership Learning Project. We'll talk a bit about that today as well as a brief guide. There's information regarding all the ecological priorities, the OWEB ecological priorities, each including a priority memo, a theory of change diagram, and a web map for each. And I'll click on one of those just to show you how that might work. Though I need to tell you, and then we'll try to remind you throughout, that the ecological priorities now are under review and will likely be updated later this year. And there's also information about the funded initiatives. So the partnerships the examples that we're using here, most of the examples that we're using here that are funded FIP initiatives, information about those initiatives and their tracking reports, looking at their progress over time, are also available. And then generally all the partnerships that I'm aware of that are participating in the FIP or not, other partnerships as well, have their own website. Some of them are pretty very well designed and thought out with lots of information that they want to convey to the broader public about the work that they're doing. And so there's just an abundance of information that's available for you to look at and peruse, to draw inspiration from. And so again, we'll be providing links to the materials related to the examples that we have throughout this document. And then finally, including some of our contact information. If there are any follow-up questions after this orientation, you can reach out to Lauren or I. There are a number of OWEB staff that you can reach out to around the partnerships or around monitoring, and so they're listed there as well. Lauren, I don't know if anybody has come in after. I'll keep putting in the link just in case somebody comes in late and wants to get into the mural board. I would, I guess, encourage you to get into the mural board because you can zoom in and out. Sometimes as we're sharing a screen, the documents are hard to read, and we'll try to remember to zoom in closer so folks can see it. But feel free to jump in, or I guess I would encourage you to jump into the mural board for the best experience.
And it looks like we maybe have 2 more people, and I just dropped the link into the chat again. So if you joined in the last couple minutes, that link should be available in the chat.
Perfect. Thanks, Lauren.
Yep.
So a quick word just about planning frameworks. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of different frameworks and approaches and processes that you can use to do a strategic action plan, even in sort of the world of conservation and restoration. But there are some that are pretty relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. So key aspects of the SAP guidance that we developed were inspired by the Conservation Measures Partnership, the open standards for the practice of a conservation. Specifically, the theory of change and the progress monitoring framework elements really drew from that guidance. Some partnerships have integrated BPA's Atlas prioritization framework in their strategic action plans. For example, in the John Day and in the Grand Ronde, those are Columbia Basin watersheds that are participants in BPA's Fish and Wildlife Program efforts. And then all the partnerships along the coast that are doing coastal recovery have some connection or will have some connection with the Oregon Coast Business Planning Framework that was developed and is being supported in collaboration with OWEB, or Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, NOAA Fisheries, and the Wild Salmon Center. And so this guidance that we've developed with OWEB really operates at a higher level. And a lot of these methodologies, as you'll learn, help folks to delve deeper into some of the more technical or detailed aspects of the planning process when doing evaluations or understanding, for example, baseline condition or developing, identifying and developing monitoring approaches. So I'm going to pause here for any questions before we move into the actual elements of the SAP. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts? Is anybody having trouble accessing any in the mural?
I'm just going to note to please mute your audio if you're on the call. Thank you.
Okay, let's dive in then. So the first 2 elements are pretty straightforward. So an executive summary and an introduction. The executive summary is ideally written in 1 or 2 pages and after the strategic action plan is completed. And so it usually contains all the key elements of a strategic action plan. The introduction is really a way to set the stage. So it describes who was involved, what motivated them to come together and create the plan, what process was used to develop the SAP. So in some cases, the process could be a participatory process with lots of folks and stakeholders and interest groups participating. It could have been completed by a subcommittee or a consultant-led effort, but providing some insight in terms of how the plan, what methodologies were used or what approach was used in developing the SAP is helpful. The introduction can also highlight some of the key aspects that you have in the executive summary, but often more detail is provided there. So for our first example, it's a long one. Don't expect you to read this, but these are excerpts from the Coos Basin Coho Partners Strategic Plan. Thought they had a really nice executive summary because they included information about the origin of the strategic action plan, the approach that they took for its development. They listed out long-term desired outcomes, what their restoration approach was, how they prioritized where they would take action in the near term. They included their restoration goals, mention of monitoring and adaptive management. So all within, I think, 2 or 3 pages, this information is provided. And just reading that executive summary, you have a really good sense of what is contained in the rest of the plan. So again, here, this is an opportunity. You can link to their website and get the information where their plan, there's a description of their team, and so on. So just as a quick reminder of how you can interact with this mural board. So the next element focuses on the people who are involved in the initiative. A partnership isn't necessarily required, but we always talk about these activities or these conservation or restoration initiatives as partnership led. A single independently operating organization can develop and implement a strategic action plan, but there are significant benefits to working in a diverse partnership of interested parties, especially in landscapes with varied land ownership and management regimes and values that are the focus of the work. And so those benefits has really become a highlight, obviously, for the Focused Investment Partnership Program because it has partnership in its name. It is about partnerships. It is about people coming together and figuring out where they have common ground to move an initiative forward. One of the documents that I mentioned, the project learning or the partnership learning project, has a really nice theory of change diagram, lots of detail here, but it really sort of describes, why OWEB has put so much emphasis on partnerships and why high-performing partnerships are potentially more likely to increase the rate and scale of restoration and actually achieve those desired outcomes over the long term. And when thinking about partnerships, and this is another demonstration of OWEB's commitment to partnerships, desire to learn more about how investments can best build a partnership's capacity towards greater performance is the support of the Partnership Learning Project. That was led by Jennifer Arnold with Reciprocity Consulting that I mentioned is a member of our team. The project consists of 3 parts. And as I mentioned, I think earlier too, is accompanied by a brief guide that provides a detailed summary of overall project findings. And so when thinking about this section in the Strategic Action Plan, the Partnership Learning Project is an excellent resource for helping partnerships consider how they're structured and or how they may need to evolve to perform at a level that meets the needs of the initiative. The ideas reflected in the 3 figures here. Types of partnerships. Let's see if I can zoom in on that. And types of partnerships in terms of how they are organized and how they function, the attributes of a high-performing partnership, and how partnerships can maintain resilience over the timescales needed to achieve their long-term ecological outcomes. All of this information was derived through I forget how many interviews of partnerships across the state of Oregon. So this information isn't sort of coming out of an ivory tower, but it's actually coming out of real world conversations, interviews, and information that was taken from partnerships that are operating here in Oregon. So I think it's high value. It's really cutting edge. You just don't see this kind of emphasis on the partnerships or equal emphasis on the partnerships as you see in sort of the ecological focus of these initiatives. A way that partnerships can formalize their roles and responsibilities is through the creation of governance documents. So Ann Moot, who's also on our team, led the development of this guidance to help partnerships accomplish this tasks. The benefits of developing formal governance documents include promoting transparency, efficiency, responsiveness, internal accountability, external credibility, and reducing the potential for conflict, or when conflict happens, having the tools necessary to overcome those. The governance document may outline the structure of the partnership, for example, which organizations are core to the partnership's planning and project implementation, and which organizations participate in a more supportive role, for example, scientific advisors, community representatives, and so on. Defining the roles and responsibilities of partners ensures that key tasks of managing the partnership and the initiative itself um, are fulfilled. So it's a really important piece. A couple of examples here. The Klamath Lake Forest Health Partnership developed an MOU to define the relative roles of each member within the extensive partnership that includes nonprofit organizations, state and federal agencies, conservation districts, and other stakeholders. And this is actually taken from their website. So again, links here if you're curious to see, the specifics in terms of what those documents might look like. Another example is the East Cascade Oak Partnership, where this figure outlines sort of the organization of a pretty large partnership. There's sort of a broad group of members to core members that are more engaged, a steering committee that directs the work, and an administrative sponsor that helps to coordinate all the administrative parts and pieces. They developed what's called a Declaration of Cooperation, which outlines the purpose of the partnerships, the purpose the partnership serves, expectations for partner participation, and operating principles. Okay, I'm going to take a pause here for questions to see if there are any hands up, any questions in the chat. Anybody want to jump in with a question or need for clarification on anything that we've covered so far? Gone through a lot in a pretty short time frame there.
I don't see any in the chat.
Okay. Great. Move on to the next element. And this is where a SAP will delineate the geographic scope and timeline of the plan. The geographic focus should align with the scale of the need and the strategies and the overall vision. In most cases, SAPs extend for a period of 5 to 10 years, even though the time frame for achieving long-term outcomes is much greater. A 5 to 10-year time frame allows for sort of a deeper dive into adaptive management, reflecting on what has been accomplished over the past years, what new aspects of the work have been learned, and how that might influence a change in course or an adjustment in course going forward. Many partnerships choose to prioritize strategies, actions, or geographies as a way of phasing or sequencing the work because it's usually a fairly daunting task. No partnership can do everything that's necessary everywhere it's needed all at once. And so breaking it out into manageable chunks is a good approach to take, but making decisions about which of those chunks to start with and how to sequence those, a prioritization scheme can help you to do that. A couple of examples, and this is where some of these other planning frameworks really come into play that allow for that detailed technical analysis of making these or supporting these kinds of decisions. The John Day Partnership, for example, utilizes BPA's planning, Atlas planning framework that helps them to identify, prioritize, and sequence actions based on the potential for improving aquatic and upland habitat. Again, a link here to get right to their prioritization page. In the Coos Basin, that partnership worked with a consultant to develop a Coos Basin net map to help inform the best locations for applying their chosen restoration strategies. And for an example, outside of Oregon, the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board used a 3-step process to develop a prioritization scheme that was focused on the locations or subwatersheds and project types or action types that would be implemented. In the end, they created an interactive map that practitioners could use to evaluate project opportunities as they're developing and identifying projects to move forward with. The next element is the vision. And the vision really is a way to describe the state of the watershed or the landscape or the species population if the partnership is ultimately successful in implementing all the actions that are determined to be needed in order to improve conditions for those habitats and species. So what is the desired status, condition of valued elements or ecological priorities? And these are usually aspirational statements and can be sort of at the highest level that can be either concise or more involved, as you can see from these examples here from the Hood River Basin, from the Coos East Cascade Oak Partnership, and from Lake County Lands Initiative. And also highlighting here real quick the definition of how we define vision. These are the blue boxes from the definition, the full definition page that I showed earlier in the presentation. So the next section in the SAP is to identify the ecological priorities. So these are the things that the partnership cares about or the community cares about. What species or habitat types are the focus of the work? So ecological priorities have been and can be species focused, which is understandable because that drives many of the conservation initiatives. That's where a lot of the funding is. However, it can be challenging to evaluate population responses to actions, or there may not be sufficient time or feedback in order to inform progress. Ecological priorities can also be habitat focused. And this is an approach that can be more inclusive and provide feedback in shorter time frames to inform progress and adaptive management. But it often makes sense, and I think this is where most of these initiatives land, is to link the two or integrate the two. Is it can be species focused, and the work is really most often habitat focused, but also specifying those habitats as ecological priorities as well. There's a couple of examples here of ecological priorities. I mentioned those that were identified and set by the OWEB board, again, under review. So those are going to change here, I think, by the end of the year or later this fall. And as I also mentioned, on the website, the FIP website, there's access to information about each of these ecological priorities that includes the memo, the theory of change, and a web map. And just a quick example for the for the coastal estuaries in Oregon, if you click on this link, you go to the web map, to a map that shows the location and the extent of the estuaries along the coast of Oregon as a way to help in your planning process and define your ecological priority. That exists for all of these priorities. Another example is the Oregon Conservation Strategy. It has strategy habitats and species as well. The habitat types are listed here. There's a whole host of species that include amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, fish, invertebrates, plants, and algae. This is also, I think I mentioned, under review, so that's likely to change. I'm not sure what the timing for that would be, but these are a couple of examples of ecological priorities. I think that the local circumstances will dictate what people care about, but linking that to priorities that exist in regional plans or frameworks would be important and a good way to access important information as well. So for each of these ecological priorities, we ask, or the guidance asks for a definition of a goal. This is sort of the next level down from a vision. For the purpose of this guidance, goals are statements that describe the desired future state or condition of each ecological priority, and indicating an expected time frame for achievement of goals would be recommended, but we acknowledge that it's hard. It takes years or even decades to achieve goals that can be set around ecological priorities. I have a couple of examples to draw from. The Klamath-Siskiyou Oak Network's goals are really, well, this one and the Oregon Central Coast Estuary Collaborative goals. These both are goal sets that are very specific to the ecological priority. They define a scale of desired outcomes, how much change do they want to see, and over what time frame they hope to see that change. So there's these are a couple of good examples. Again, links to their websites and more information. Okay, I'm going to take another break here. Pause for questions. We're going to do a handoff at this point. But while we do that, any thoughts, questions? Seeing anything in the chat? Denise mentions that the Oregon Conservation Strategy is now the State Wildlife Action Plan and will be adopted later this week or this week. Thanks, Denise.
Okay, Robert, I'm ready to share my screen.
Okay, I will stop.
Taking just a moment here. That's not the screen that I want to share. Are you guys seeing my desktop?
No, just black. There we go.
There we go. Okay, perfect. And I see there's one comment in the chat, so let me find that before.
I think it's the latest is Denise.
It was just from Denise.
Yep,
Perfect.
and then the link to the new strategy vision.
Okay. I'm just gonna do a little. Okay. So let me get started here. So thanks, Robert, for going through all those sections, and I'm just going to take a moment to summarize what Robert talked about and to position us to get ready to launch into the conservation context. So Robert described that background of OWEB strategic action planning framework. He talked about those sections that frame the strategic action plan, so the executive summary and the introduction, and really sort of set up for that strategic action plan. He talked about the people who are involved, so whether that's a partnership or whether it's an individual organization, but in the context of partnerships, some of those resources for partnerships to really hone their function. And then he talked through these sections that start to frame the SAP at a higher level. So that geographic scope and timeline, the vision for what a partnership intends to achieve, and the ecological priorities and goals. So just sort of starting to introduce people to what that conservation context is, but at that very high scale. So I'm going to talk about 3 sections of the strategic action plan that really get into the nuts and bolts of a restoration initiative. So the 3 sections I'm going to talk about right now are the conservation context, the theory of change, and then the progress monitoring framework. So for the conservation context, the purpose of this section is to frame the situation that has created the need or opportunity for conservation and restoration, to explain how the specific circumstances of a place have contributed to that conservation need, and also to identify the specific ecological needs that will be addressed through a conservation initiative. So this section asks for information about 4 major drivers that influence the condition of ecological priorities. Those are the biophysical and social context, the historical and ongoing activities that contributed to the situation, as well as plans and efforts to address the conservation need. And finally, how climate is impacting or anticipated to impact ecosystem function and the effectiveness of conservation actions, as well as how the proposed conservation actions will increase resilience to those impacts. So the conservation context also asks for key documents and recovery and management plans that will address that conservation need. And identifying and referencing those limiting factors that are identified in recovery and management plans in this conservation context section creates a clear connection between the conservation or restoration need and the strategies that will be proposed in the theory of change. So it really sets the stage for those proposed strategies. So we have pulled a couple of examples that show that connection between the conservation need and limiting factors. So the Hood River Basin Partnership grouped their biophysical, social, historical, and climate factors that are contributing to each limiting factor, and they grouped those by limiting factors in this table. And immediately above that, they named the plans that identify those limiting factors. The Harney Basin Wetlands Collaborative summarized their key habitat threats in a table. So this is a very clear and accessible articulation of the conservation need in that geography. And then the Oregon Central Coast Estuaries Collaborative used a situation diagram. I'm going to try to move these stickies for a minute. And they used that diagram to formulate, inventory, and index the conservation context. So the situation diagram identifies contributing factors in orange, the conditions and circumstances resulting from those contributing factors that directly impact habitats in pink. Just going to zoom in here a little bit. The ecological consequences in sort of this olive brown color. And then the interventions needed, which are ultimately the strategies, which will also be represented in their theory of change or results chain. Any questions about that conservation context before I move on to the theory of change? Okay. Not seeing any hands.
No.
Okay. So the theory of change really responds to the conservation context. Once those conservation needs and the factors contributing to them have been laid out in that conservation context section, the theory of change responds to that by showing and explaining what a partnership plans to do to address these and why they think their approach will be successful. So the theory of change describes how a conservation or restoration initiative is expected to result in the desired ecological conditions that are summarized in that ecological goal. So it's worth taking a moment to talk about what the value is of developing a theory of change, because it is an investment of time and energy. So first, the process of building a theory of change together allows a partnership to chart their restoration initiative by formulating out loud and agreeing on what needs to be changed. So these are usually limiting factors or those contributing factors, and what strategies and actions and by whom are needed to accomplish those changes. And then the resulting results chain diagram, which is this diagram that we're looking here, albeit in a simplified version, and the corresponding narrative description become useful tools for communicating to the public and funders and for revisiting within the partnership what the partnership plans to do and to what end and for what purpose. It's also worth touching on who's involved in developing the theory of change, and this will differ by partnership, but it's important to engage the appropriate technical experts as well as any participants in the conservation or restoration effort in development of that theory of change. And prior to completion and finalization of the theory of change, to ensure that you have agreement from the full partnership on the strategies, actions, and linkages between those and ecological outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the specific components of the theory of change. And I believe all of these are defined in the definitions. We just have the theory of change definition up here in the blue box, but if you want to look specifically at the definitions, you can go back to that definition page, but I will be describing them as well. So the theory of change is often represented as a results chain diagram, and it identifies and shows the relationship or the linkages between, so the selected strategies, starting on the left in this lightest green color. Those are the strategies that are needed to achieve the ecological goal. And then those are broken down into actions that make up each strategy or within each strategy. The outputs are implementation outputs or implementation results. And so those outputs directly result from each action and can be indexed directly to each action. So you can see that's represented here. Action 1.1 results in output 1.1. And then ecological outcomes over here in this broad blue section are anticipated to occur or evolve in response to outputs. So frequently, multiple different actions and the outputs of those actions are needed to contribute to accomplishing any given ecological outcome. So you can see that in this simplified diagram, strategy 1 is red, strategy 2 is orange. And you can see that for many of those outcomes, they require both of those strategies to achieve that outcome. So we recognize that outputs and outcomes are, those are definitions that are specifically used within this strategic action planning framework, and they can get a little jargony, and we just wanted to try to make them as clear as possible. So outputs here in sort of this gray-brown color are the conditions that directly result from implementing a restoration action. And I've started to think of these as an as-built condition. So in this particular example, where a strategy is mechanical thinning and prescribed fire, and an action under that strategy is to implement thinning and use prescribed fire to reduce small diameter trees and fuel density, the immediate output resulting from that action is a reduction in small diameter trees and fuel density. So then in contrast, your outcomes are the result of the ecological response over time, so from near term to long term, to those output conditions that resulted from a restoration action. So I think of a restoration action as really potentially changing a trajectory, or maybe changing the severity of a situation. And then the outcome is that ecological response to that intervention. So following the previous example, these could include things like improved growth and vigor of conifers and aspen, or increased diversity and abundance of understory native vegetation. And both of these near-term responses or outcomes are responses to that output condition. And ultimately, outcomes and responses here to some degree is interchangeable. Outcomes is the language in the strategic action plan. And then longer term outcomes require realization of multiple near-term outcomes, and they can also be a little bit more difficult to measure. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. In this example, a long-term outcome could be landscape resilience to extreme fire, drought, insects, and disease is increased, so that resilience is increased. So we're going to go back to that figure 1. And we're going to talk about actions, outputs, and outcomes in the context of this theory of change. So articulating the relationship between actions and outputs, so these two middle green columns, creates a foundation for tracking restoration progress, which is also known as implementation monitoring, by clearly showing what results are expected from those restoration actions. And then identifying the relationships between outputs in green and outcomes in blue helps to highlight which outcomes or habitat attributes are anticipated both to occur and be observable through effectiveness monitoring. So in the near term, potentially over about a 6 to 10 year time frame, and because they're expected to occur in that near term, they can provide early information about ecological response if a partnership chooses to monitor ecological outcomes. In terms of those longer term outcomes, identifying that relationship between outputs, near term and longer term outcomes can help identify which outcomes are still important and might be selected for monitoring, but where you might not see change in that near term. And those responses are expected to occur over a longer time frame. So these relationships between outputs and ecological outcomes are sometimes supported by published literature, or they may be hypotheses about how the ecosystem functions and will respond. One more point about the ecological outcomes is that ideally they connect back to the habitat and or species limiting factors. And so what I mean by this is that the specific quantified attributes that are the identified ecological outcomes in the results chain represent a reduction in the limiting factors and a trend toward values in those attributes that provide suitable habitat. So, Robert mentioned this previously, but for each OWEB ecological priority, there's a theory of change diagram shown on the left that identifies restoration strategies and actions, implementation outputs, and ecological outcomes that are commonly needed in each ecological priority habitat type. So the ecological priority theory of change can actually serve as a template of sorts or as a good starting point for formulating a theory of change for your own initiative, recognizing that the specifics of each restoration geography will likely differ in some aspects. Okay, going back to figure 1. So to wrap up on the theory of change, I like to know when I'm done with something. And so what I think of as the boxes to check to know that your theory of change includes everything you want it to are that those 5 elements, so your strategies, your actions, implementation outputs, ecological outcomes, and ecological goals are identified, and that the relationship between actions and outputs and outcomes are illustrated, described, and ideally indexed so that you can understand from that indexing which relates to which. Okay, I want to talk very briefly about social strategies and actions. The central focus of the theory of change is on the ground restoration actions, and also actions that are necessary to get to or enable on the ground actions. So the theory of change may incorporate social strategies and actions where these are integral to restoration work or where they're important to the partnership or initiative. Actions to achieve social outcomes might include situations where social license is needed to allow restoration work to proceed, such as in the case of smoke and air quality associated with prescribed fire, or where social benefits of restoration work, such as economic or job outcomes, make that work more compelling and facilitate implementation of restoration work. So we're going to look at a couple of theories of change. I'm going to zoom way in here. This is going to be a good place to follow along. So the Harney Basin Wetlands Collaborative used the standard Marathi results chain format. They indexed their outputs to their actions, and they indexed their outcomes selected for monitoring and for which they developed outcome objectives to their outputs. So that indexing is represented in these small blue circles with blue rectangles, and those are outputs, and small purple circles with purple rectangles, and those are ecological outcomes from near term on the left to long term on the right. On the very far right over here, in this yellow box, they included human well-being values that are resulting from realization of the conservation goals, and those include both economic and cultural values. And then their narrative theory of change presentation is formatted to be very accessible and clear, and it references the indexed outputs and outcomes in the body of the text. So you can see this 1 to 2 is those first two outputs. E4 is an ecological outcome. Okay. All counties sage grouse, and I know the resolution is not great on this one, but you can see my main points, if not the specifics of the actions. So they do have a clear theory of change diagram that connects their actions to their outputs and their outputs to their outcomes. And they've very clearly signaled that by using a color coding convention where they've color coded their strategies, actions, and outputs, which each directly correspond. And then in terms of their outcomes, they've used colored arrows corresponding to that color referencing system to show which multiple actions contribute to which outcomes. And I think this is really effective. Their actions and outcomes are specifically referenced to their limiting factors and reduction of the limiting factors that are described within their theory of change narrative section. So the format, sorry, popping back here for a moment, the format is pretty similar to the priority theory of change diagram, and this partnership might have referenced and modified the ecological priority theory of change diagram in development of their own results chain. And then finally, their narrative theory of change really clearly describes how the strategies and actions are expected to achieve outputs and outcomes. Moving on, I wanted to show an example of a results chain that's really similar to the ecological priority results chain. So this is the Klamath and Lake Forest Health Partnership results chain. And they may have, again, used that dry type forest habitat theory of change diagram as a starting point, but modified and elaborated the elements that are specific to the Klamath and Lake County restoration context and needs. And I do not know for certain that either of these partnerships did reference those in development, but you can see how that ecological priority diagram could provide a good starting point for developing your theory of change and results chain. Klamath and Lake counties, their partnership also, I'm going to zoom in right here, did identify anticipated social and economic benefits to local communities, and they are monitoring those and reporting those outcomes to the partnership. And then just to really focus on the social strategies and actions, the Klamath Siskiyou Oak Network built a standalone results chain for what they call enabling strategies, which are strategies that are necessary to create the social, policy, and economic conditions that enable and facilitate their restoration work. Okay. Before I move on to the progress monitoring framework, are there questions about the theory of change?
There's a hand up, Terry.
And Terry, you think?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Lauren. My question, goes back a little bit, but you were talking about, ensuring that you engage the right tech experts and then who's going to participate in the restoration, of course, and that you have agreement. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on, like, at which point to engage the community in which the work is going to occur. Like you can use the SAP to inform the community and funders, but do you also recommend doing, I don't know, like workshops or open houses to get their input earlier in the process before final plans are identified?
Yeah, I will give you my take on that, and then I'll open it up to Robert and OWEB staff to provide their input as well. Development of a theory of change is a fairly technical process, and it really tends to be grounded in what those limiting factors and what those ecological and conservation needs are, and then what strategies or interventions are going to be effective and useful in changing those or addressing those. And that's why I emphasized having the technical experts. It's also going to depend on sort of who are the implementers, really. Who are the people? So going back to what strategies and actions and by whom, if there are strategies and actions that are needed, but you don't have access to the people who have the skills to implement those strategies, then either you need to get those people in the room or you're not going to be able to use those strategies and actions. So, and I will say, and I'm sure lots of folks on this call have developed a theory of change, and it can be a somewhat, again, arduous and just technical process. And so I work with Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and the Deschutes Partnership, and the approach that we've taken is to start with those technical experts and the practitioners, the implementers, and the technical experts tend, in our situation at least, to be the agencies. So those are the folks who we have in the room really like doing the sausage making, really hashing out the details of like, are there strategies that are just going to happen regardless of what we say in the strategic action plan? How do we, all of the nitty gritty. And then it would be at a later stage that we would present that to sort of more broadly folks who will, potentially be peripherally involved or be affected by those actions. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Lauren, I just want to add a couple thoughts that may get us a little bit off track, but I think it's a really important question for the broader, I think maybe this may be, Terry, what you may have been getting at, sort of for the full planning process. There are different points in the planning process and decisions made along, all elements of the plan where the community could and probably should be involved, to have ownership and to have their values reflected in the work itself. Lauren indicated that the theory of change process is sometimes even it's a difficult process, and it requires a certain state of mind to sit in a room and sort of hash this kind of thing out. But I think the idea of bringing in the social sciences to the work is equally as important as bringing in the ecological sciences to the work, which would allow you to understand how best to engage and work with the community. It's tricky business, and it requires, it's not tricky in a bad way, but it requires a lot of thought. I'm sure all of you know who work in communities that have a strong connection to the to the ecological priorities that you're focusing on, what that requires and what it's like. And there's been a lot of missteps that I've made in my long past as a practitioner trying to understand and sort of navigate that. But I'm not really answering the question other than a lot of thought needs to be put into it. It can't just sort of be a technical process that's done by a few off into the corner and then you sort of bring it to the community and say, this is what we're going to do to you. It's
Okay.
gonna, yeah. So
Yeah,
anyway.
actually, I think Lauren and Robert together, you both did answer my question. Like,
Okay.
so, thank you.
Yep. What's our first question? So we really got excited to answer some.
I can keep asking questions if you need them.
And I was just going to ask if any OWEB staff wanted to comment.
I agree with Terry. I think you and Robert answered it well. And I think the only thing I'd add is that, we talked a little bit about a vision statement at the front end of a strategic action plan. And I think there's often the need for community input in developing that vision. So, and I think that's what Robert was getting at too. There's a lot of front end engagement, I think, that informs the direction you're headed. And then when you get to the point of doing a theory of change, that you're implementing that vision through connecting the dots with some technical knowledge to help you get to the outcomes that achieve the vision. And thanks also, Marshall, for the comment in the chat there about the systems model being beautiful, and just highlighting that to spotlight the wonderful work that that Robert and Lauren and their team have done to create these graphics and visuals for us. It's been really helpful.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Marshall. Okay, so we're going to keep looking at this figure one for a little while longer, but we're going to focus on the strategic action plan progress monitoring framework. And so I want people to be able to see both, because the strategic action plan progress monitoring framework really distills the information that has been it distills those relationships in the theory of change to the outputs and the outcomes and how you're going to know if you're achieving them. So in developing the progress monitoring framework, a partnership takes the outputs, usually all of them, and then selected outcomes, or those ecological responses from the theory of change. And I'm going to be referencing these tables on the bottom. The one on the left is the implementation progress table, and the one on the right is the ecological progress table corresponding to outcomes. So the partnership will assign a specific indicator, so that's on the right column in each of these tables, for each output or outcome. So for example, acres treated by thinning. And then they assign objectives as specific target values for their outputs. So in this particular example, that objective, the output is existing and potential open forest habitats are identified and thinned, and the objective quantifies the amount by which that will be done. So by 2025, ecological thinning and fuels reduction actions are implemented on 1,200 acres. So acres there is your indicator. So a partnership also, moving over to this ecological progress table, identifies the key ecological outcomes and their associated indicators where the partnership expects to be able to see change within near term, so again, approximately 6 to 10 year time frame. And these key ecological outcomes are the ones to consider for effectiveness monitoring and evaluation of that anticipated ecological response. So ideally, a partnership does assign an objective consisting of a target value or range of values for those ecological outcome indicators. So that objective is in that center blue column. But because ecological responses and outcomes are strongly affected by environmental and climate conditions, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with assigning one target value. And for this reason, assigning a trajectory of change, so for example, increasing or decreasing or a range of values, or fundamentally a minimum value that the partnership anticipates they might see in response to the outputs of restoration actions, allows a partnership to acknowledge the uncertainty while providing the ability to evaluate ecological progress. So the boxes to check to know that your progress monitoring framework is complete are that you have your initiative outputs over here on the left with target values, your objectives and indicators, as well as on the right in the ecological progress table, key ecological outcomes identified with indicators and with target values assigned as trajectories or minimum values. So then how is this used? The progress monitoring framework can then directly inform the partnership's work plan. This is referenced in the bottom right of this figure. Those work plans could be annual or biennial or on some longer time frame. And these work plans detail the complete list of actions a partnership expects to implement within a specified time frame. And those actions correspond to the outputs and targets or objectives detailed in the progress monitoring framework. So the progress monitoring framework can also ultimately inform reporting. And this is just one example from the FIP program. OWEB uses a progress tracking report format within that FIP program to provide information to their board of directors, to legislators, and to the public in this standardized format about the results accomplished with FIP funding by each FIP initiative. So those output indicators and targets that were defined in the progress monitoring framework, or a subset of those indicators and targets, provide the information for reporting on progress toward implementation objectives. Later in a conservation or restoration initiative, if effectiveness monitoring data are available, then the ecological outcomes, indicators, targets, and results may also inform reporting about partnership impact. And I just want to speak to monitoring for a brief moment. I talked a little bit about implementation monitoring of restoration actions and effectiveness monitoring of ecological outcomes. And there is guidance on the OWEB FIP webpage. It's called Monitoring Restoration Initiatives, and it does discuss how a monitoring plan fits within the context of a strategic action plan and the theory of change, and how those dovetail and inform each other. And more broadly, this guidance document identifies the elements of a monitoring plan, and it discusses considerations for developing an effectiveness monitoring approach that incorporates best practices for producing quality data. So we're gonna look at one example progress monitoring framework, and Robert has beautifully summarized the Oregon Central Coast Estuary Collaborative progress monitoring framework in this graphic. So OCCEC has 3 strategies, each with multiple sub-actions that culminate in implementation or completion of a conservation action. So that first one is collaborate to fund and implement estuary restoration projects. There are a number of actions, in this case, they're sequential, that are needed to achieve that strategy, and they culminate in implementation of a restoration project. So outputs of those conservation actions are identified with quantified objectives, sort of within the box, that consist of target values that are assigned, as well as the specific indicator that will be used to evaluate progress toward the objective identified. So in this case, the output of restoration implementation is that restoration projects are initiated or completed, and that is quantified. So by 2028, restoration projects are initiated on at least 900 acres in the Yaquina and Alsea estuaries, and the indicator is the number of acres where restoration has occurred. So ecological outcomes that occur in response to the outcomes of cumulative outputs were identified. 5 of these outcomes were selected for monitoring, and specific indicators corresponding to key habitat attributes were identified. So objectives here in this case were defined as target values within the context of reference conditions. So you don't see a lot of numbers here, but for example, on this first outcome, the outcome or the ecological response is that tidal and floodplain connectivity and hydrology are improved. And the specific objective is to establish full tidal regimes throughout the restored area that match reference conditions. The specific habitat attributes, or in this case, physical attributes, that were identified for indicators to evaluate the degree to which that ecological outcome is achieved are salinity measurements and surface and groundwater fluctuations. And then ultimately, accomplishment of the outputs through restoration actions and attainment of ecological outcomes together contribute to realizing the conservation goals. So here, those are tidal wetlands that are functional across 60% of the initiative focus area, estuary lands that have been protected, and increased landowner acceptance and understanding of the ecological benefits of estuaries. Okay, I'm going to pause there, ask for questions about the progress monitoring framework specifically. You can also ask questions about anything we've covered to this point, and I see that we're a little bit past our halfway mark, but once we take questions and finish with that, we will take a 5-minute break. Did anyone see any questions?
I don't see any questions, Lauren.
People are ready for a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is 11:18. Let's come back at around 11:23. Does that sound good? Okay, we're gonna keep the Zoom going. I'm gonna stop sharing. Oop, I'm not gonna annotate. And we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Give folks a couple more minutes here. I see one empty chair. Okay, I think we're good to start. 25 after, we gave a couple extra minutes. All right, the handoff is now back to me, Lauren, or did you want to say anything? That I don't see any questions.
Over to you, Robert.
Okay. So I'm sharing screen now. So we're on the home stretch here. So a key feature of these landscape scale long-term restoration conservation initiatives is that they all start with sort of imperfect understanding or incomplete knowledge and understanding. And so there's often some degree of uncertainty. But also another key feature is that folks will learn, there'll be substantial learning along the way by doing, by implementing, by measuring and monitoring as the science advances as well. And so we really want to emphasize the importance for a partnership to create an intentional process for gathering, evaluating, and applying new information as it comes in, again, through monitoring, through the evolving science and expertise, new folks coming in to participate in the partnership, and the development of, new, improved project implementation techniques, things like that. And so adaptive management, I think, carries a little bit of baggage. It's in concept, something that's easy to understand. You learn by doing, you apply that learning to do better going forward. But in the context of restoration and conservation initiatives, it's become, or at least in my experience of an observation, is a very difficult thing to actually adapt, especially when the focus is so strongly on implementation. So year in and year out, it's a lot about getting work done on the ground and taking the time to pause and reflect on what's been accomplished over some period of time, whether it's a year, whether it's 2 years, is sometimes difficult. But in order to help provide some guidance, this is, I think, our final guidance document that was produced was to help folks really develop and think about and a framework for adaptively managing restoration initiatives. So it does, sort of discuss the traditional cycle of adaptive management of planning, monitoring, evaluating, and adapting, but also discuss a number of ways that we think might improve the effectiveness or the potential effectiveness of developing an adaptive management approach. And some of the main keys, though there's a lot more listed here, is that commitment to annual processes, to put it on the schedule, and to allocate the resources needed to do that, to make sure that folks are at the table and that they're gathered and that the information that's needed is gathered, processed, analyzed, and ready to be presented. And often it also benefits from what we call a champion. So somebody who really holds ownership of adaptive management, typically somebody who's also engaged in monitoring, who does all the coordinating, the communicating, the gathering, the summarizing, and sort of the post-meeting or the post-adaptive management session materials. Because there was sort of a call for support and a need to better understand what the real needs were, a pilot study was led by Ann Moot, again, a member of our team. So there was a pilot study, and now there's subsequent work that's happening as well around this. Pause and reflect in developing updated strategic action plans with some partnerships. but in that pilot project, Anne worked with the Rogue Forest and the Klamath Siskiyou Oak Network to update their field reviews and to better serve as forums for shared learning. She also worked with the John Day Partnership. And through that experience or those experiences, both in helping to find ways and pilot ways for those initiatives to integrate concepts of adaptive management or principles of adaptive management, there were some findings, again, from real world experience that she was able to summarize here. And those are the 6 that are listed here. So reflective discussion is just as important as quantitative monitoring. So there's a lot of focus on monitoring, sort of quantitative monitoring of responses, especially effectiveness monitoring. But that reflective discussion is just as important. Iterative systematic evaluation and adaptation process are desirable but daunting. It's still difficult to do, in part just getting folks together, but it takes a lot of work and effort, and that's where the support of a champion comes into play. It's important to attend to relationships and different learning styles. So we're all humans. Partnerships are diverse in terms of their experience, their background, what their priorities are. And so that needs to be taken into account as well. It's not just a technical process, but it's a sort of a social, people-led process. Maintaining communication with all partners and other stakeholders is important and challenging. That's something I think that sort of stands on its face. Adaptive management requires significant commitment of time and dedicated funding to support it. And that's, I think, where some of the challenges are, is in annual work plans, especially to integrate adaptive management into the process and make sure that funds are allocated to it and that there are some accountability and responsibility for members of the partnership to participate and support it. This is a similar point is building adaptive management tasks into work plans and budgets, and integrating them into existing organizational procedures can make it more feasible. So that's the strength of the governance documents. It's the strength of the partnership where roles and responsibilities are clearly defined, is that building adaptive management into, especially the process itself, and building it into the sort of the cadence of work that happens within a partnership from year in and year out, or from biennium, is really important and critical. The last element that we'll cover that's included in the strategic action plan is this idea of sustainability. So the question of how the partnership will sustain its capacity to implement the SAP over the desired time frame. And in the guidance, we list at least 3 areas for discussion, that there should be sort of a plan to secure sufficient funding. I know this is difficult. It's hard to predict how what funding would be available and if the scale of funding will meet the need, especially in sort of today's world. Uncertainty is relatively high, but it's important to think, at least as best that you can, how that sufficient funding would be secured to support the work going forward. An approach to maintain the partnership's functions, commitment, focus, and collaborative effectiveness. So that's focused on the partnership and its operation, and what I'll talk about here in a second about the resilience, and a plan to sustain capacity for efforts needed to track progress. That the idea of monitoring and tracking progress, to show progress, to evaluate progress, to see whether or not the work is advancing and contributing to those longer term desired outcomes and goals is important. So the partnership learning project, again, based on sort of real world experience of talking with partnerships that are operating in Oregon, offers an insight here around what Jennifer calls the threads of partnership resilience, or the elements that contribute to resilience. So things that she identified through her conversations, like camaraderie, success breeds success, formal commitments, the governance document, and how the partnership is built to operate and function, consistent funding, something that's often outside of the control, or usually always outside of the control of partnerships in terms of what's available. Organizational anchors. So some organizations or members of the partnership that have substantial presence may be able to provide some of that resilience. Shared leadership. participatory leadership, openness, and external relations. So relations with entities outside of the partnership that are key for its success. So the idea here is that the care and feeding of the partnership is just as important as any other aspect of the initiative, and it's important to address those and talk about those as a partnership when developing your strategic action plan, and sort of to demonstrate your commitment to that. So that is the last element that we're going to cover in terms of the strategic action plan. And let's see. And so we wanted to open this up to any and all questions. We're at about 11:34, so we have 25 minutes or so left. We put a few questions in here to maybe prime the pump. Through our experience, we know that there's a lot of dense material here. Some of this creates challenges in terms of understanding, how it's presented in the strategic action plan. But I wanted to pause here, open it up for questions, and if we don't get any, maybe we can start working through some of the questions that we have here and see what kind of responses we get.
And there is one comment in the chat from Janelle who had to take off, but she said, these are a lot to organize and facilitate. Are you going to be speaking about this in the last half hour, which we didn't specifically, and she says, more specifically, should we hire consultants? So that's a question that we can discuss and address in addition to these.
Yeah, do you want to address that? And I think OWEB staff will have a lot of experience here because there's just such a diversity of partnerships out there that the circumstances really dictate what's going to work best for them. And we've seen consultants used in many of these situations, either a technical consultant that really knows sort of the depth or the details or the technical details of doing these kinds of plans, to someone who's more of a facilitator. So the technical expertise exists within the partnership, but they need somebody to sort of guide the process as a facilitator. And I think that's worked pretty successfully in the past as well. But the statement that it is a big lift is true. I mean, I think everybody on the call here can attest to that reality. Does anybody else have any feedback or thoughts about?
I guess I would say that in some ways, Robert, I think you just addressed sort of the two roles of a consultant. And so in some ways, the consultant would be like a champion for the process, right? Or like basically the project manager for creating a strategic action plan. And in that sense is like the person who's scheduling people and making sure the process keeps moving forward. And then there's the technical side of it. So ultimately, all of these sections are about getting all of the information that's out there from disparate sources in one place and organized so that people can easily access it. And so I think there is a certain degree of just putting one foot in front of the other and, starting at the beginning and starting to address these questions and starting to formulate them. I've just been working on some grant applications, and it's a similar process. You look at the prompts and questions and you bring to bear the information, or in some cases develop the information, but you see what's needed for that process.
Denise has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I think I just want to impart to folks that we've in reviews sometimes joked about there being an idea that there's a magical unicorn facilitator out there, and that people think if they can just find the right facilitator or consultant, they're going to make this whole process really simple and easy, and the partners can just come to some meetings, and then the result is going to be a beautiful strategic action plan for a 20-year plan that's going to, hit on all of the components that OWEB needs and guide the partners to do the work on the ground. And that is never how it works. And so the magical unicorn facilitator can be a part of what makes working through this successful, but it still takes a lot of commitment from the folks to come ready to meetings, review materials, participate in the writing. And there's no expectation from OWEB that these need to be beautiful, glossy, publication worthy documents at the end. It's okay for them to reflect the character of the location and the issues that the partnership is addressing. And so I think sometimes folks feel like they need a consultant to help make it look a certain way. And it's not about it necessarily looking a certain way, but about the intent and the thought and the deliberations that partners have put in to think through what is it going to take to get from where we are now to where we want to see this system 20 years from now. What is the body of work that it's going to take for us to get there? And you're working through this process to help identify that pathway. But the document itself doesn't have to look a certain way. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks, Denise. Jim's got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I like what Denise just said, but to get back to the question of do you need a consultant or not, I think one of the things that I would weigh in on is how long has the partners within a partnership actually collaborated together over time, not individually one-on-one, but how often have they kind of come together and how have they interacted with one another? If they kind of have that long-standing piece, then maybe they don't need it and they can work through this. The consultant will be a facilitator, just like you had mentioned. But if you're a group that is not all kind of operated in kind of the same sandbox together over time, that might be an indicator that maybe you're more likely to be successful in completing this project if you have somebody helping you, assisting the partnership. And so that's kind of been my experience working with a couple of different groups.
Christina has a question in the chat. So should one assume that any and all applications for OWEB funding are expected to include all of these documents? I'll let OWEB staff speak to that.
Thanks, Lauren. For applying to become a FIP partnership, you do need to have a strategic action plan, which includes a theory of change, and you do need to have a set of governance documents. For other OWEB offerings like open solicitation, you do not need to have those. However, like I said earlier, having at least some of the thinking behind them helps answer some questions, common questions that our technical reviewers are going to ask about a project, which are basically the why here, why now questions around a proposed restoration project. And so the more of that thinking that you have behind selecting a particular project approach and a particular project location, I think is going to be helpful. But in open solicitation, those documents are not required.
Thanks, Eric. Luke is, I think, next.
Yeah, thanks for the informative and comprehensive training. Yeah, I wanted to dovetail on the two most recent questions from the group. And to Jim's point, the history of the partnership working together can really inform who needs to be involved. And as a consultant working with a newer partnership, I'm wondering, can jump to the beginning of this training a bit and speaking to the scope of ecological priorities and geographies of a plan. I'm finding as soon as humans get involved in a planning process, folks want a plan to be all things to all people, and you can easily get get messy into comprehensive planning issues if you're dealing with an urban center or wildfire resilience planning. And so can you speak to some tools that are either inside or outside of this guidance to keeping a group on a particular scope as it relates to a planning exercise like these?
That's a tough question. I mean, the guidance is really, this is what's in a strategic action plan, but as these questions are coming in, and I guess even through our experience, we realize even a bigger lift is how do you manage a process? How do you keep the people involved and those kinds of things? So that's a skill set that, or at least a role that we didn't really outline in the guidance, but we recognize it as being important. We've experienced and observed that too, but I don't have any like, I mean, maybe some other folks who've been more engaged over long. I know Tim's got his hand up next, and now he's been involved in a number of, as a supporter of a number of, maybe he's got an answer for us.
Thanks, Robert. I've got a separate question.
Okay.
But I can, Luke, this is something I've been working, developing strategic action plans for about 7 years now. Keeping everybody pointed in the same direction is a challenge. One of the things as a facilitator that I try to do is at every meeting, go over the ecological priorities, talk about the key ecological attributes that are going to be the focus. I just, for me personally, I just kind of hammer those every meeting. This is what we're talking about. This is our focus. I know that's not a lot of help, but I do find that just kind of like starting off any given meeting with identifying the original set of goals and priorities, it helps to set the stage a little bit. I don't know if that's going to be super helpful for you, but like I said, it's like you said, as soon as humans get involved, I think everybody wants a plan to be all things to all people, and it never will be. So I think acknowledging that up front is also kind of helpful. I'll pause and see if there's any other comments to Luke's question, and then I'd love to circle back.
Yeah, I would just add to Luke's question that this is something where having a skilled facilitator really helps, because they often have tools that can be used to help build consensus, and those tools range from simple, like thumb sideways, thumbs up, thumbs down, to much more complex in trying to help a group come to some agreement, consensus around how are we going to narrow our priorities, and that of course is one of the biggest challenges I think that partnerships face in developing their SAP and then even later on implementing the SAP.
I just wanted to really briefly add, I think the partnership styles in the Partnership Learning Project Guide can be helpful for just sort of setting a context for what you're all doing together. So it's not specific to defining or refining the geographic scope, but it can sort of, I think, focus your group, or like let you take a look at who you are, who you might be and who you might not be, and maybe help coalesce a little bit.
And just to follow up a little bit on Lauren's point there, I'll put a plug in for the governance documents, and having something in place even before you engage in strategic action planning might be useful. I mean, getting things like your decision-making process and communication styles down on a shared document could be really helpful for partnerships.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Back to Tim for your question now.
All right. Thanks again. And Robert and Lauren, thank you so much for holding this, and OWEB staff. Like I said, I've been doing this for a number of years, and this is super helpful for me, kind of having done this quite a bit. My question is, now that I've been doing this for about 7 years, we have partnerships that developed an SAP years ago that are kind of getting to the end of their short-term work plan. And we are having these conversations about adaptively managing or updating the SAP. So this is starting to get into a realm that's kind of new territory for me. And I'm just wondering if Lauren or Robert or any of the OWEB staff have thoughts that you guys could share about a process to update an SAP. Again, a lot of work goes into it. Yeah. So again, I'm looking for any sort of insights onto, yeah, how you guys might think about approaching updating a plan. It can be expensive, and like I said, a lot of work has gone into it. So would love your thoughts.
I can speak a little bit to that. So the Deschutes partnership we were one of the cohort 1 FIPS, and we have just completed updating our strategic action plan. And I think what that update looks like depends very much on what you plan to do next with your strategic action plan. So for us, that largely looked like doing that progress tracking and revisiting all of the very many actions that were included in our strategic action plan. And I'm pretty sure we wrote that strategic action plan in 2015. And I think we had actions that went out to like 2040 or 2045. So it was a much longer term. And I would say the sort of the guiding theme of that update was inventorying what has been completed, recognizing where there were actions that for various reasons may no longer be priorities or even feasible, and then calibrating to what are the priorities and the needs now. And we had, I believe, a partnership technical assistance. Sorry, I should confirm what kind of grant that was. Denise might know. But we did have a grant that was specifically for the objective and the deliverable of updating that strategic action plan and our partnership MOU.
Yeah, and I know we're getting down on time, but one thing that's happening right now that I think might be, I hope that will be super helpful for this kind of a process is that Ann Moot, I mentioned the pilot work that she'd done with the John Day and with folks in the Rogue. She's currently working with the John Day. I think they're either updating their SAP or they're updating their SAP, but to begin that process, there's sort of this reflective review process that she's gone through. Is really a look back towards what was done, what sort of really inventorying all of the past and how that would then inform the new plan going forward. And I don't know exactly where she is on that. I think there was going to be a report or some kind of a result. There's been some talk about that already, but I feel like that might be a really great resource for anybody that's getting ready to update a strategic action plan to make sure that that inventory at the front end, that reflective review is done to really inform what's going forward. So we hope to be able to share that soon. Yeah. Any other questions?
I might just add one other thing in response to your question, Tim, which is, it sounds like likely a lot of work has been done and likely there's a lot more work left to do, right? And so as you reflect on that and as the partnerships reflect on that, take the time to also celebrate and, the work that's been done, because that can also, recharge and re-inspire a group that maybe has been doing a lot of work for a while, but still has a lot more to do. So take the time to celebrate the wins too.
Thanks, Jillian. I think that's great advice.
It is. Denise.
Yeah, and I'll just say one thing that folks who are just at the beginning of developing their strategic action plans might take away from this conversation is the idea of having that progress tracking set up from the beginning. It's so much easier to do an update of your strategic action plan if all along the way you've been tracking your projects so that it's just rolling those things up. rather than having to, do a look back at 6, 10, however many years of projects and however many staff have turned over in that time frame, and trying to reconstruct, what the outcomes were, that were achieved through those different projects. So just doing that progress tracking and setting that up right at the beginning, when you're just starting out, can make that updating process. Your future selves will thank you for that. So.
Good point. Thanks, Denise. Any more feedback on the questions already posed, or any other questions? Okay. We're just about out of time here, but we are really interested in feedback. I know right now isn't the feedback time, but we encourage you to send us any feedback in terms of what was helpful for the process, or for this orientation. And as you're preparing to develop or update a strategic action plan, what pieces were missing. I don't know if it's missing from this orientation, but I'm really thinking about tips and tricks for how to do a SAP process, and not, we know what we need to do, but how do we manage a group of partners in moving that forward? But we really would look forward to receiving any feedback, any and all feedback. In addition, I go back to there's the contact information again. If you have any questions about any of the material that we've covered today, need any clarification, would like to see more examples, would like to have a conversation, reach out to us with those questions or with those needs. We're limited in terms of what we can do sort of beyond providing sort of feedback or follow-up support from this orientation, but we'd be more than happy to, and really be eager to have any conversations. We learn a lot through every interaction that we have with folks that are doing this kind of work. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then I don't know if anybody else from OWEB or Lauren has any other final comments, and if not, then I can move towards a close, or if anybody else has anything that they want to contribute here at the last couple of minutes.
Robert, there was that question in the chat just asking how we'll be sharing the webinar and the slides.
So I put a quick response to that in there. We will be posting this recording. I think where we're going to link it to, which is the most logical place, would be the FIP webpage. There's a resources section on a sidebar there, and likely the link to this recording will be there.
Great, thanks, Jillian. And the mural will be accessible. I think it can be accessible for as long as we have it. And so the link will be, you can access the link, save that link if you want to go into the mural to do whatever you want to do in there. That's going to be available to you as well. Any other final thoughts or questions? Thanks for noting that, Ken. Okay. Well, I guess that since I'm talking, I'll sort of bring things to a close. Really appreciate the attendance here. I'm a little surprised. We had a pretty good group of folks come in, a pretty large number of folks. So I really appreciate the interest and your time and attention for hanging in for the whole thing during this busy time of year. So I don't know, Lauren, any closing thought you have?
No, just thanks for being here, and thanks for the good questions, and thanks to OWEB staff for providing some responses as well.
Yeah, and thanks for all you guys do for Oregon, for the natural resources of Oregon. I think it's inspiring and amazing. So thank you. Okay, signing off then.